Okay. So hopefully this will work this time. Sorry, everyone, for those technical difficulties. I'm sure Twain is looking down, making fun of us. But thank you so much for joining us. I'm very excited about this conversation. Steve and I love to talk Twain and Twichell, and we love to get down Twain and Twichell rabbit holes. So hopefully that will happen tonight, and it will be interesting and entertaining for everyone. So to begin, Steve, we want to know, how did you get into Twichell specifically?
Well, thank you, Mallory, and also thanks for putting up with me for probably about 10 years to working together at the Mark Twain House and various curatorial and other roles. But
it's tough. It's tough, but I deal with you.
It actually is tough working at the Mark Twain House, Mallory, because I've heard your stories, but maybe not working with me, of course, is a dream, but everything else was. Anyway, enough of that. Twichell, of course, the Reverend Joseph Hopkins Twichell of Hartford, for those who don't know, ended up perhaps ironically becoming Mark Twain's best friend, despite Mark Twain's famous aversion to the hypocrisies of religion and such. And that's the kind of thing that interests people, and it sort of interested me. I was working for a Northeast magazine, which was the Sunday magazine of the Hartford Current back in the 90s, and got the assignment to write about Asylum Hill Church in Hartford, and found that it was a very involved church and involved in local activities and in the area of Hartford known as Asylum Hill. Great, wonderful place. They call it a church in the city with a heart for the city. But it's I'm not a member. I just became interested in the place, and it had a relationship with Mark Twain, which I hadn't realized. There's a pew in the place. My ear thing keeps dropping out, but that's just life, I guess. There's a pew in Asylum Hill Church which has a little brass plaque. This is where Mark Twain sat, and this is the pew that he rented in the time that Mark Twain lived in Hartford. People would, in Protestant churches like that, would rent their pews. And then I learned that the minister was his best friend. So how does that work? We're used to Mark Twain of the later writings in which he excoriates religion and excoriates the deity. There's a wonderful passage in one of these letters in which he talks about how somebody doesn't know something, somebody knows less about something than the deity knew about astronomy. That was, he had no compunction in a time when religion was a tremendous factor in American life to ridicule it in its foolishnesses. So what made up these men's friendship? I went to the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale, where Twichell's papers are kept, and little by little got a sort of a feeling for this person. I wrote some articles for Northeast magazine, one framed on a walk they would take, they said every weekend in the spring and fall, from Hartford about 9 miles up to a tower on a nearby mountain, and use that as a sort of frame for telling about their friendship. Ultimately, just to speed things up, wrote a biography that came out in about 12 years ago. But before that, these things are, sorry.
I feel like they're playing pranks on you tonight.
I think they are. I think Mark Twain is surely in the wings of our Zoom, our crowdcast here.
Yeah.
So, as I said, I ended up hanging around Twitch quite a bit. Before the biography came out, I was able to work with a great Mark Twain scholar in Britain, Peter Messent, who had come over to do research on an important book he did about Mark Twain's male friendships, the friendship with Twichell, the friendship with William Dean Howells, the friendship with Henry Rogers, the Standard Oil executive. I was able to show him around the Beinecke a little bit, and I had made up a document how to find things. Anyway, he came upon the letters that Twichell wrote, unrelated to Mark Twain, the letters that he wrote to his father and other family members during the Civil War, because Twichell. What if I do it this way?
That's perfect.
Is that fine? Okay. I prefer these things as a sort of fireside chat, and I don't usually plug those things in my ear by the fireside. Anyway, Pete suggested that we publish a volume of these letters from the Civil War, which we did. There it is. And here's the biography I mentioned. And all these things, of course, are available, as somebody pointed out, over on the side if they're links. Well, without going on for too long, that finally led me to working on the letters. What's that?
So you did the Civil War letters.
Yes.
What made you decide to do one that focused solely on the letters between Twain and Twichell? And I know you worked with Peter Messent and Hal Bush. So how did the idea come about, and how did you guys split up your responsibility for working on it?
Well, that was really thanks to Hal Bush, the great Mark Twain scholar out in St. Louis, who Pete and Hal and I came to Mark Twain from all different directions. I came from writing a sort of journalistic, or rather to Twichell, sort of a journalistic account of his life. Hal came into it in a wonderful book he wrote called Mark Twain in the Spiritual Crisis of His Age. He got deeply into the Twichell story, and Pete, again, from the direction of impeccable Mark Twain scholarship and an interest in his male friendships. Hal had for years been transcribing Twichell's letters to Mark Twain, and the letters from Mark Twain that ultimately ended up in our collection had been, of course, transcribed for years by the Mark Twain Papers and Project out in Berkeley. Hal suggested at one point to Pete, would you like to work with me on a volume? What am I going to do with all these letters? As I heard the story anyway. The two of them got together working on this. So it sort of grew, the project grew from this tremendous work that Hal had done. Pete ended up being sort of the lead editor for reasons far too complicated to explain. He actually had to produce the book in sort of two different versions over the course of several years. And at one point they decided, well, maybe we could invite Steve in because we need a few more hands on this job. And I was able to read some of these transcriptions, and because of my immersion, I guess, in Hartford and the world of Mark Twain here, I had some local knowledge that I could kind of provide, and a lot of Twichell biographical knowledge. So if he made references to family members, I could sort of figure out more quickly who those people were. There was a wonderful, if anyone who knows about Hartford in the 19th century knows that there was a governor's foot guard. In fact, there still is, as I understand, going back to the 18th century. And they had an armory known as the Foot Guard Armory, which was a great institution of that Gilded Age era. And I think the guys, Pete and Hal, had tried to work out the name in a letter and ended up with Fort Gerard Arthur instead of Foot guard armory. So those are that's the kind of absolute trivia that no one needs to know, except maybe in transcribing that one sentence in that one letter. But, to make a long story short, we spent several years checking over the transcriptions, digging out some new letters. Again, I have to give credit to Pete. Pete wrote an extraordinary amount of sort of connective material. Each section of the book covers a period of years, and he's written these marvelous introductions to each one of them. A marvelous introduction to the whole book, in fact, in which I'm just going to read one part. He says, the dialogue, Mark Twain scholars for years have quoted from these letters. The great aphorisms that you see engraved on the wall of the Mark Twain House Visitor Center, a lot of them just come out of these letters. But this is the first opportunity, this is the hardcover version, the first opportunity to sort of see these things back and forth in a dialogue. As Pete says, the dialogue between these two men, one an inimitable American literary figure, the other a man of deep perception who himself possessed both narrative skill and wit, has been much discussed by Twain biographers, but it has never been presented in this way before as a record of their surviving correspondence, of the various turns of their decades-long backs and forths, of what Twichell described in his journals as the long, full feast of talk with his friend, whom he would always call Mark. So
that's sweet.
There we are. That's in a very large nutshell, or perhaps a whole bag of nuts. That's the story.
So now we've talked about how you came up with the project of the book and how you've worked on it. But to dive a little bit more into the relationship between Twichell and Clemens Twain, maybe I should call him Mark, since that's what Twichell called him. I'd love for you to tell everyone how the two of them met.
Well, this goes back to the publication era of The Innocents Abroad. As you may recall, or may know, probably know, Mark Twain came to Hartford on a business trip. He came to see the publisher of his very first full-length book, The Innocents Abroad, an account of his travels in Europe and Asia in 1867. So the following year, he was in Hartford, and he was staying with his publisher, Elisha Bliss. Bliss was a parishioner at Asylum Hill Church, the same Asylum Hill Church that's there today. According to Mark Twain, in the story that he told his first and official biographer, Albert Bigelow Paine, he was at a social event, and looking. There's two versions. In one, he's looking at a picture of Asylum Hill Church, and in the other, he's looking across the street at Asylum Hill Church, because Bliss, in fact, lived across from the church. And he said, "Oh, I know your church." He said, "That's the Church of the Holy Speculators," because this was a rather posh church. It was the upper crust of Protestant Hartford, of Congregationalist Hartford. There was also the Episcopalian faction in the city at the time, and other Baptists and everybody else. So the hostess said, "Shh, the minister is right behind you. Keep it down, Mark." So Mark Twain turned around. There was Twichell. They shook hands, and that was the beginning of the famous friendship. The next thing you know, they were discussing books. Twichell invited this strange new man from the West to come and sit by his fireside and have dinner with him and meet his kids and his wife Harmony. And the two of them what I like about the very first visit, that first dinner, was that they got up he got up to leave, Mark Twain. They went to the door and stood there from 9 to 11, continuing to talk. And that conversation, as we know, went on, for more than 40 years. So what appealed to them in each other, Twichell, I think, he liked things that were exotic and unusual. And when I did the biography, I learned that when he was a young man on his dad's, his dad was a tanner, but there was a family farm too. And what the handyman on the farm was an Irish guy and could just tell him wonderful, wonderful stories about Ireland. And, so Twichell, I think, was intrigued. After he went through his ministerial training and all that, he and his wife both wanted to go and be missionaries in the Near East, in Turkey, but decided against it. They found their life kind of just became very, very anchored in Hartford for their entire lives, really. But he liked, and then he got involved later with the Chinese educational mission, where a whole group of Chinese students came to town. So he was interested in the unusual, and I think he just loved listening to Mark Twain's stories. He's just said that in one point in his journal, he said there's a certain kind of storytelling that is just never going to this will never be seen again, he said. He was just in awe. Now, why did Mark Twain like Twichell? That's sort of the other question. Twichell was, as Pete said, he was a man of wit and intelligence and insight, but he wasn't at the level that Mark Twain was. You don't see the bound volumes of Joseph Twichell turned into a set, or the collected sermons. He did write some wonderful sermons. He did, don't get me wrong, but he had a sort of uneven way of writing, and but I think he was probably, of those three people that Pete wrote about, the male friendships. Howells was a great intellectual and professional friend, and certainly intimate to some degree. Rogers, the same, maybe more like the rich patron that you go and onto his yacht and tell stories, that kind of thing. Of course, happens to us all the time. Right. Actually, it did happen to you, because you've been on the Mississippi River on a riverboat, yes, telling stories. But Twichell, I think, was the most intimate friend, and maybe it had to do with the fact that they met when Mark was courting Livy Langdon from Elmira, New York. It was a very intense time in his life, and some of the letters that they write, or that he writes to Livy around the time of some of these early letters that I'll be reading a few later, he sounds extraordinarily interested in really being a Christian and being religious and following all the precepts, and he found Twichell to be a great advisor in this, of course. Later they parted, which we'll read a little bit about that later.
Well, do you think, I know that, we talk sometimes about how Mark would call his wife Livy Gravity because she helped him to stay grounded sometimes. Do you think that Twichell had a similar effect on him?
Yes, very much so. I will jump ahead and read you from a letter that Clemens wrote after, one of the central tragedies of their life, of course, the Clemenses, was the death of Susie in 1896. And let me just, this is where okay, Susie has died. The Clemenses are in England. They had, Livy had come back when she heard Susie was ill, but it was too late. Twichell went to the boat and possibly broke the news. There are other versions in which she learned in other ways. But afterward, they kind of locked themselves up. They isolated themselves. And during the following, she died in August 1896. In the following January, Twichell asked his friend if he really wanted him to keep writing. You know, does he just want to be alone? Does he just want to be on his own? And Twain writes, "Dear Joe, do I want you to write to me? Indeed I do. I do not want other people to write, but I do want you to do it. The others break my heart, but you will not. You have something divine in you that is not in other men. You have the touch that heals, not lacerates. And you know the secret places of our hearts. You know our life, the outside of it, as the others do, and the inside of it, which they do not. You have seen our whole voyage. You have seen us go to sea, a cloud of sail, and the flag at the peak, and you see us now, chartless adrift, derelicts, battered, waterlogged, our sails a ruck of rags, our pride gone, for it is gone, and there is nothing in its place. The vanity of life was all we had, and there is no more vanity left in us." So, obviously, Twichell was a great comfort here at that time and at other tough times.
Well, something that I really loved about the book was going through, the topics would change from very trivial matters to very serious matters. And I thought that was really interesting that they really could talk to each other about anything. And it would go from something really silly and funny to something very serious, like what you just read, or maybe getting angry about politics or religion. And it's fascinating how they go back and forth about various things happening in their lives. I mean, one of the favorite letters, hopefully you'll read from it, that I enjoyed was when Twain is complaining to Twichell about the fact that he can't find his sock.
Yes.
And I just thought, that's hilarious. I would never think that you would see Twain go on and on and on about something so silly as losing a sock, but it's hilarious. And I love that they have that relationship.
Okay, yes. So we'll jump to 1878, 79, when the Clemenses are in Europe, this time on a sort of a massive, a trip that ended up in the book called A Tramp Abroad, in which Twichell shows up as a character, a sort of caricature of Twichell. But after Twichell, Clemens brought Twichell over he paid for his fare to come over and tramp around the Alps with him. And then Twichell returned, and the Clemenses went on ultimately to Munich in 1879. And here's the story. He's at this point, Mark is back with Livy, of course. "Last night I awoke at 3 this morning, and after raging to myself for 2 interminable hours, I gave it up. I rose, assumed a cat-like stealthiness to keep from waking Livy, and proceeded to dress in the pitch dark. Slowly but surely I got on garment after garment, all down to one sock. I had a slipper on and the other in my hand. Well, on my hands and knees, I crept softly around, pawing and feeling and scooping along the carpet and among chair legs for that missing sock. I kept that up and still kept it up and kept it up. At first, I only said to myself, 'Blame that sock.' But that soon ceased to answer. My expletives grew steadily stronger and stronger, and at last, when I found I was lost, I had to sit flat down on the floor and take hold of something to keep from lifting the roof off with the profane explosion that was trying to get out of me. I could see the dim blur of the window, But of course it was in the wrong place and could give me no information as to where I was. But I had one comfort. I had not waked Livy. I believed I could find that sock in silence if the night lasted long enough. So I started again and softly pawed all over the place, and sure enough, at the end of half an hour, I laid my hand on the missing article. I rose joyfully up and butted the washbowl and pitcher off the stand and simply raised blank, so to speak. Livy screamed and said, "Who is it? What is the matter?" I said, "There ain't anything the matter. I'm hunting for my sock." She said, "Are you hunting for it with a club?"
I love that.
Now, one thing about writing about Twichell or anybody in relation to Mark Twain is that Mark Twain tends to creep onto stage and upstage the other person. And I think I've only read a little bit about read letters from Mark Twain. Is that correct?
Yes. Well, I was just going to ask you, a lot of the times you and I talk about how much we love Twain and how descriptive he is, that he's wonderful, a master of description. So what do you admire about Twichell's writing? And is there something in his writing that makes you crazy?
Yes. Here's what makes me crazy. I'll try to get rid of this one fast. Twichell could get very self-conscious. He had a heck of a time writing writing his sermons, and he had a miserable time doing it. And once in a while, and his speeches, he could be extremely self-conscious. Excuse me. Dear Mark, Harmony's report of a talk she had with Livy the other day. Harmony is his wife, of course. Livy is Mark Twain's wife. I remark in passing that there's a certain moral beauty attending in my mind to the idea of a conference between those two women. Has suggested to me, not logically or in any direct fashion at all, the propriety of saying to you, apropos of that House Prince and Pauper business, he got it into a feud with the journalist Edward House. That's a whole other story. That I share the opinion, which must be universal with all who know you, that you are wholly and scrupulously, and even fastidiously, a man of your word, that nothing is more impossible than you should evade, or otherwise than more strictly and to the last letter observe any contract whatever into which you would consciously entered, whether with or without formality. Okay. Now here's another example of his letters, which are, well, this is, there's a number of good stories. I'm going to do, as I said, he took this trip with his friend Mark to the Alps and to the Heidelberg and had a wonderful time in Europe. And several years later, a wealthy parishioner, a man named Case, local, had a huge printing business in Hartford at that time and lived right, he was a neighbor of the Clemenses. He lived just a block away. And a parishioner of Twichell's rounded up Twichell and a couple of other parishioners to go off to the same areas, to Europe, to the great capitals, look at the great cathedrals and go to the Alps and the whole thing. Twichell writes back to Twain about this trip. And this is quite a different kind of writing. Suddenly he's in the storytelling mode. He says, for example, we've got a boy of 18 on the trip who is absolutely without qualification for deriving either enjoyment or profit from the present tour, being wholly devoid of historical information, wholly, or of the slightest interest in anything but machinery, and without enough gumption to enable him to hunt up machinery. He sat down, bored, in a chair in Westminster Abbey while the rest of us went in to view the royal tombs, saying that he didn't care to see them. You show him a venerable structure, place, or relic and tell him what it is, and he remarks simply, well, what of it? And to complete his charm, he is a boor in manners and improves every chance he gets to practice the art of incivility. Religious principle alone has often restrained me from killing him. But then when he really takes off on the fellow who's the host of the trip, Mr. Case, This old gentleman has to urinate about once in 20 minutes, and I have to provide him opportunity for it. In fact, my prevalent pursuit is hunting after a urinal. I bundle him out of the cars and snatch him along to the Ohms, the men's room, and it does seem as though he'd never get through. Lively as his kidneys are, the rest of the machinery partakes his constitutional slowness, and the whole party are in an agony for fear he'll be left. I fetch him back at last on the trot and boost him in just in time. And in fact, they're stopped at a station, and they didn't have restrooms on trains. So this guy is, the train is about to leave. I fetch him back at last on the trot and boost him in just in time, and for 15 minutes we are all happy. This Paris is a great place for him. He can stop like a dog at any corner, because Paris was famous for its sort of odd outdoor urinals that there's a name for that I can't remember. But you could actually sort of see men's heads poking out the top of this thing as they did their business. So
that's a little Twainian and Twichell right there.
Yes, I think that's what it appealed to him. He once said, when he was frustrated with that other kind of writing, he wrote to Howells and he said, you know, he's such a great storyteller. Well, why can't he inform himself with a pen? Was the way he put it.
Well said.
Just winding up poor Mr. Case, who was a great benefactor of the Hartford Seminary, and his portrait hangs in their library. And I'm sorry to get into his private problems this way, but they're at a glacial area in Switzerland called the Gorner Grot. The Gorner Grot, you remember the charming afternoon we went up there. We had a good day for it this time, only it was piercing cold. So cold that my mustache froze solid. And as for the old gentleman, he lost his hold on his bladder entirely. My sakes, how it did fetch the urine out of him. I thought he'd make a new glacier.
I like that.
So,
good
sorry,
for
Mr. Case. But yeah, there are numerous instances of that in the book. Let me see what else I've got.
So we're going to do a couple more questions. For those of you in the audience, if you have questions, please make sure you use the Ask a Question feature, and we'll be doing that shortly. So as you're looking for your next excerpt, Steve, another question that I had for you, and this focuses more on Twichell, is especially now in the past few years, we always talk about how timeless Twain is, that things he wrote over 100 years ago remain so relevant to what's going on in the world today. And Twichell, for several things that he spoke about during his lifetime, are also very relevant today. And so can you share a little bit about some of the things that Twichell talked about that sort of come into play with what we're going through now? Because I think Twain gets a lot of credit for that, but I think Twichell also speaks a lot to that degree as well.
Yeah, well, Twichell he was obviously a more reserved man. He did he was more conservative, more perhaps conventional in religion, even though his religion did. He was a part of a liberal movement in Congregationalism, which kind of opened things up from the old Puritan days. But he was very much involved with one thing, international events. I mentioned the Chinese Educational Mission, which was a project of the government of China to send a lot of students to America, and it sort of it enlightened him about the role of the Chinese. He even got to go with a Chinese emissary down to Peru to sort of look into the problems of the the so-called coolie laborers down there in Peru and how they were being exploited and pretty much oppressed. He was an abolitionist since the very early days of his life. And speaking of events today, he did. He was called upon in 1896 to dedicate a statue of a former president of Yale, the man who had been president when he went to Yale in the 1850s, Theodore Dwight Woolsey. And this is a great statue that you can still see, this man sitting in his academic robes in the middle of the old campus at Yale, with one toe slightly shiny because you're supposed to rub that toe for luck. That's an old Yale tradition. But when that statue was being dedicated, it was 1896. It was a tradition it was right around graduation time. It was a tradition to plant a sprig of ivy for each class that was graduating. So the class of 96 decided that they were great. It was a time for reconciliation of the North and the South, that the nation had been divided. It was safely back together again. We were all pals. Was their idea, these young students. And so they wanted to bring a sprig of ivy from the grave of Robert E. Lee, and I think originally another sprig from the tomb of Ulysses S. Grant, and plant these as their class ivy to portray the great coming together. Now, they, of course, didn't seem to worry that there was another side to this famous reconciliation that a scholar named David Blight has written about wonderfully in a book in which, frankly, the African Americans who had been freed from slavery were back in essentially a kind of reestablishment of much the same thing in the South. It was a year of lynchings. It was a year when the Supreme Court ruled on Plessy versus Ferguson, the great decision that kind of encoded segregation for the next 50-odd years. And Twichell heard that this sprig, the Grant thing somehow didn't work out. Twichell heard as he got up on the platform to dedicate this statue, that there was a sprig of ivy from Robert E. Lee's grave in Virginia that was going to be planted right by the walls of Yale, which to him was the most, it was a great symbol of freedom and the restoration of the Union and the abolition of slavery, which were all things that Woolsey was deeply involved in. And he got up and he extemporized, and he was not a man to always extemporize other than maybe in a lighthearted way. But this time he said that the bronze statue in front of him would avert its eyes if it could see that a sprig of ivy from the grave of Robert E. Lee, and he said, a good man, but the representative of an infamous cause, should ever sully the structures of ever loyal Yale. Something I'm paraphrasing, but in effect, and this caused a riot. And the next thing you knew, talk about tearing down monuments. I think by the end of the week, the ivy was gone, and he was getting hate mail from people in the South, and he was the old guys who had all fought in the Civil War, were carrying him on their shoulders practically. They were so happy about his stance against what he saw as a traitorous activity in the interest of human bondage. Right. So that's that's the kind of thing. You can see so many parallels, as you say, and
yes.
Yeah.
So we're going to wrap up. I'm going to ask you a two-part question as our last one. So the first is, what is your favorite letter? You could pick one from Twain and one from Twichell if you can't decide, or you can just give me one answer. And I'd also ask you to end on maybe a more personal note of what these two really meant to each other. When I was going through the book, something that really jumped out to me, that this is after Susie died, is that Mark is telling Twichell how much Twichell means to him and how he wants to hear from him, and he's helping him sort of go through the loss. And Twichell writes him back and says, "Dear Mark, your letter received a few days ago did me a lot of good. I am glad you love me, as you must, old fellow, to the end of the chapter." And I just thought that was so beautiful, and in a nutshell, kind of exemplifies what they meant to each other. So to wrap up, what is your favorite letter? And can you sort of take us out before the audience questions with, your observation of what they really did mean to one another?
Yeah, well, I can read you a very short, this isn't exactly a favorite letter, but I love it because it's so clearly an exchange. I mean, it's this is Twichell, and maybe this isn't the best. I actually liked, this is more an exchange. Okay, we have Twichell saying, he's kind of, they're debating in their later letters when they're Mark Twain's no longer in Hartford. It's the early 1900s. Mark Twain is deep into sort of his a dark period when it came to the religion and God and the fate of the earth. And Twitchell's coming back telling him that he's wrong. He says, the world is moving forward. Everything's getting better. We're, it's the dawn of the 20th century. And he says, oh, there's an eddy now and then, and here and there, but the stream flows in that direction. Climb out of your hole, Mark. Get up where you can see a distance. Drop your cussing and shout glory. Not, of course, and then he went on to talk about some other things, but get out of your hole and shout glory. And Mark Twain writes back, Dear Joe, I have a puddin-head maxim. When a man is a pessimist before 48, he knows too much. If he is an optimist after it, he knows too little. And that is engraved on the walls of the Mark Twain House Visitor Center for sure. But this is where it came from, this wonderful dialogue. And as far as Twitchell's letters, I certainly like the ones about Mr. Case's incontinence. But there's a similar one on the boat back from Europe. And he must have been infected by having walked these alpine paths talking to Mark Twain. If you have a copy of A Tramp Abroad, in chapter 23, Clemens describes what their conversations were like, how they went from he said, we discussed everything we knew during the first 15 or 20 minutes that morning, and then branched out into the glad, free, boundless realms of the things we were not certain about. Mm-hmm. So I always like that one. But here's Twichell writing about a fellow passenger, a butcher from Allegheny City, Pennsylvania, which is now a part of Pittsburgh, a man named Beilstein, J.F. Beilstein, who turns out to be his cabin mate and swears a lot and doesn't even mind that he's staying with a preacher. And it turns out his main interest in life is butching. So his whole thought was upon it, that is his trade as a butcher. His interest in it amounted to a burning enthusiasm. He had no desire, pride, or ambition that was not connected with it. He had acquired considerable wealth, but he told me with unconcealed vanity that his wife, of whom he appeared exceedingly fond, could tend shop just as well as he himself could. She was a good butcher too. I can't begin to report all the entertainment he afforded me. Every day I had a long talk with him on some head of his invariable theme. He was always charming. He used to go to the cook's galley and borrow a sharpener and stand for half an hour whetting his pocket knife and looking dreamily out upon the sea, as if he had a vision of slaughtered beeves that he was soon to enjoy their heavenly rapture of cutting up. It's a very short part of a rather long letter. So I guess those are the ones that where he's just telling a friend, oh my, as you said before, just this is what happened to me today, and he's not all roiled up in those rolling phrases.
And so, as the last question before Jody comes back on, and I know this is a heavy question to answer in a short time, but overall, what was their relationship? What did they really mean to one another? I know Twichell presided at Twain's funeral, and he was going through a lot of turmoil with his wife Harmony being sick at home as well. But that he couldn't barely hold back the tears talking about Mark, his best friend, at his funeral, and they just have this bond. And what does the friendship mean to you, having studied both men so intimately?
Well, I think, as I said, for some reason in history, they found a way of supporting each other, and I think Twichell was, as you said, he was sort of he's someone who grounded Mark Twain, who could give him a sense of reality about things. He was a foil for his arguments. He could be Mark Twain's agent. When Mark Twain was in Europe and writing about the Christian Science, which was one of his obsessions for a while, he would send Twichell off to learn things about it. And so, they had a great sort of mutual and supportive relationship. In fact, let me end with Pete, and let me thank particularly Hal Bush and Pete Messent for their important role in this. If we were smarter, we would all have been on here together, because it was really a joint effort. But I don't think I can find it quickly. But in it, basically, the ending says that it was a two-way street. It was not simply a fan whose existence had nothing to do with any part of life other than being the foil to this great man. And the great man was, what I like is they had a terrible fight in 1883, which I can't get into too much of a story. But every time Mark Twain had a fight with somebody, the journalist House, who I mentioned, or his later secretary, Isabel Lyon, that would be it. He would write about a diatribe about them, and over. Bret Hart. Twichell, he did something to him. He published something in the newspaper without permission, and Clemens was furious at him and would not deal with him for at least probably about a year. How they reconciled seems to be lost to history, but by a year later, this was 1883, this happened 1884, Twichell was showing Mark Twain how to ride a bicycle, and then later, which he wrote about hilariously, and then finally they got together in a political effort later in 1884, and that's but so they were friends again, and that never happened with Mark Twain. So I think it might have been that early intimacy when their lives were just starting out in Hartford in their respective ways that kept them together.
Well, thank you, Steve. This was a very enlightening conversation. There's Jody popping back up. But while she gets ready to ask the audience questions, I highly recommend, you should be able to find the link in the chat, purchasing the book. It is extremely enjoyable. Here it is in paperback. And you could just spend so much time leafing through. And as I said, reading about silly things like a lost sock, and then hearing political debates about McKinley. And so it really is a treasure trove. And I highly recommend it for those of you who are looking for some nice winter reads. So. Oh, we can't hear you.
We can't hear you.
Let me look at the questions well. All right.
Jody has contracted laryngitis.
So here's a question. It says, Twichell's letters often have a great turn of phrase. Oop, I'm losing it. Considering that Mark Twain's other good friends, William Dean Howells and Henry Rogers, had similar great editions of correspondence published in the 1960s, why do you think Twichell's letters were sadly overlooked for so long?
Well, that's a really good question. And there was I know that Twichell's journal was kind of under lock and key for a long time. It was in the Beinecke, but it could only be used but with permission of family members who thought it might, it might tell too much about people in Hartford whose descendants were still living. New England can be a very, sort of clammed up place. It's not famous for its talkativeness. And maybe something like that happened with the letters too. I think also, Howells was, of course, a literary man in his own right, in a novelist and critic. And so I think that was sort of a natural to have two literary men talking. And Rogers was, it's very biographically interesting, but I can't really completely answer the question. I simply don't know that answer.
Great. Thanks, Mallory, for taking that on as we figured out why my mic wouldn't turn back on. Thank you both so much. This has been such a fun program, and we have a number of questions here, and then I have one of my own. So James Golden, our mutual friend, question has 5 votes from our audience. So I'm going to start with this one. It says, can you say more about the social world of the late 19th century Hartford and Nook Farm neighborhood? How did Twichell fit into it? And how was their friendship, or was their friendship a public feature of Hartford society?
Well, the second question first. So it was definitely a feature of Hartford society and even beyond. There were people in England who knew that he had a minister for a friend, and it was very much, especially when after A Tramp Abroad came out, because the character Harris was based on Twichell. So and definitely in Hartford society that was the case. As far as the social situation in Hartford, it was the Gilded Age. It's sort of like what we've seemed to have stumbled into again these days. There was tremendous inequality. There were people, people getting richer and richer because there were really no bounds on their getting richer, and there were people who because of that were getting poorer and poorer because of the ability to frankly exploit large numbers of people in the factories. It always struck me that when Clemens came to Hartford, he wrote in one of his letters to his newspaper, I don't know where the poor of Hartford are. I can't see them anywhere. Everyone looks rich around here. But in fact, that was not true. There were slums down by the Connecticut River in those days. And as soon as he became friends with this minister, Twichell took him to the what was it called? Not the poorhouse, but the equivalent of the poorhouse, where he said sights that he had not seen in Damascus and in the poorer cities and towns that he visited in the Middle East. So it was a very, very separate, divided society. There are many studies of it. Twitchell's role in this was he did bring the church out of itself a little more. It was sort of part of the liberal congregationalism. They were involved with the city mission, which was an important part of Hartford. It was sort of an early effort at charitable work in the city, and a union for homework formed later. And Twichell is very much involved in all of these things. He does write about visiting a factory and just being struck by how people could perform the same, physical activity, over and over again every day. A very amazing, that's an amazing piece of one of his sermons that tells that story, as I recall.
Great. So the next question that has 4 votes, so lots of interest in this one. It's again a 2-parter. So the first part is, does this collection of letters contain annotations not found in the collected letters of Mark Twain? And then the second part of the question is, was Twichell ever an editor of Twain's work, similar to what Livy did?
I think the answer to the second is no. Although there's another wonderful letter comes to mind. Twichell's letter on this subject doesn't exist, but there was a point at which in the early 1900s that Clemens was getting into a lot of trouble. He came back to America after living in Europe and was furious about the American war in the Philippines. And he said, I can't reconstruct the quote, but in effect, he said the flag was polluted by these actions and got a lot of criticism. And there's the implication is that Twichell wrote him something saying, tone this down, Mark. Just, you're gonna get your publishers mad. Mm-hmm. And Clemens writes back and says, you're not going to edit me, Joe, on this. I'm going to say what I say. And you're a keeper of men's consciences. How can you say such a thing? I want to be able to say what I say. So maybe in that sense. And the first part of the question was?
Is there different annotations in this book versus the collected letters of Mark Twain?
Yes, very much so. This brings to mind our sort of 4th shadow editor, which was the wonderful head of the Mark Twain Papers and Project, Bob Hurst, who made it possible for us to use letters from Clemens that had never been published before, and that aren't available on the online site. The Mark Twain Papers and Project site brings you letters up to 1880, and we're working on the rest. But he gave us special permission to use these, which was, and frankly, kind of final edited them himself to make sure that they were up to their standards. And that was an extraordinary thing. So yes, there are many letters that have never been seen before in print.
Great. Well, next question is about how often did they write each other, and were the letters typed or handwritten? And about, when they were living apart, how long did it take for letters to, cross the ocean to get from Hartford to London or wherever they were around the world? Do you know?
The one I knowledgeably is that they are all handwritten. There were some, it might have been an attempt to do it typewritten, but I forget whether that was to Twichell or not. The other questions, I don't know how long it took mail to take. I bet somebody who's over in the chat could tell us right away. And there was something else in there too.
About how often did they write each other?
How often? That depended. Sometimes there are letters saying, I haven't heard from you, Mark, in months. There are other ones that are immediate. When they lived in Hartford together, there are a number of letters that are just going cross town. Well, did you see what was in the current this morning? And
their kind of version of text messaging each other was writing letters, right?
Because there would be several deliveries a day. It wasn't, that was the one way you could communicate. So it's not like today where just one mail delivery a day.
Yeah.
But that's not a complete answer, but at least partial.
Yeah. So one question that I have that's not in this list. So we had Kevin on a couple months ago talking about how Mark Twain sounded. Do we know what Twichell sounded like?
That's Kevin McDonald, the great, the wonderful collector and and great supporter of our museum in so many ways, out in Austin, Texas. We don't. I did, back in the late 90s when I got into this stuff, there was a grandson still living, and there's even a photo of Twichell in the Adirondack Mountains with his grandson in a little pack basket on his back. And he remembered his grandfather getting very angry at him for being woken up, that if he woke up his grandfather, he could be quite angry. I told this to a Mark Twain scholar who said, well, go back and find out, what was he like? What did he look like? What did he talk like? And I asked this grandson who lived, I think, in San Diego, and he said, I don't remember any of that. That was the end of that avenue of research.
Yeah.
Another man I met who knew him, this is somebody who was 5 years old in 1912, I think. Again, this person, a wonderful guy, he's long gone though, sadly. And Twichell had come over to his house to baptize his sister, all he could remember was that he was very attentive to him as a small child, that he would pay attention to him, which a 5-year-old, the kind of thing a 5-year-old would remember. But no recordings, Mark Twain had recordings that were all sadly lost. I don't think, because he's not so studied, you do come across things about him in odd archives. Mm-hmm. Perhaps somewhere there is a wax cylinder of a sermon that he once was recorded giving, but I've never seen anything like that.
Yeah. So we're about out of time, so I want to do one last question, and you just mentioned his sermons and things. Is there any collected volumes of his sermons out there?
No, there are. They are in the Beinecke at the library. I made copies of some of them, but they haven't been published. I would think that it would be best to publish excerpts from them.
Sounds like another project, Steve.
I know, right? And that's exactly what I was thinking.
I don't know about that. But they're good. Maybe let me think about that.
Yeah. I will say that Steve is in regular correspondence with both Mallory and I on an almost daily basis. So all the questions that we didn't get to, I will forward on to Steve, and we will get them out to you guys so that we can get those answered. Thank you all so much for staying with us tonight with the brief little difficulty there at the beginning. I wish we had longer than an hour. I'm sure we could talk all evening. But I want to thank again our sponsors, Connecticut Humanities and the Center for Mark Twain Studies, for supporting the Trouble Begins series. I want to thank all of you for showing up tonight. And again, if you're able to help support us, that donate button is down there at the bottom of your screen. And check out our website for all of our digital programming. Not being open to the public right now, we are throwing all of our effort into digital content. There's lots of author talks coming up. There's Christmas programming. Lots of fun things coming at you through our website, Facebook page, Instagram, Crowdcast, all of that. So check it out, and we'll see you next time. Thank you, Mallory and Steve, for a wonderful program.
Thank you, Jody.
Thank you. Bye, everyone. Good night.